techniques, we've transformed old historical engravings and paintings into vivid, lifelike scenes. So you won't just hear the story of Edinburgh, you'll see it, as close to the real thing as we've ever been able to get. Let's begin at the beginning.
Long before Edinburgh had a name, this land was already alive with people. The earliest evidence of human habitation in the Edinburgh area comes from Cramond, a coastal settlement at the mouth of the River Almond, just to the northwest of the modern city. Archaeological finds there, uncovered during excavations in the early 2000s, date back to around 8500 BC. That's the Mesolithic period, the Middle Stone Age. These were hunter-gatherers, following the land and the seasons, living off the sea, the shellfish beds, and the salmon-rich river. They left almost nothing behind, except a scattering of flint tools, hazelnut shells, and the faint trace of their hearths, buried for thousands of years beneath layers of silt.
Thousands of years pass. Bronze Age and then Iron Age communities settle on the high ground, on Castle Rock, on Arthur's Seat, on the Braid Hills, and out on the Pentlands. These were defended hilltop enclosures, home to farming communities whose culture bore strong similarities to Celtic peoples across Atlantic Europe. They built timber roundhouses, they raised cattle, they farmed cereal crops on the surrounding slopes, and they traded along a network of routes that stretched far beyond the Forth. When the Romans marched north into the Lothian area toward the end of the 1st century AD, under governors such as Gnaeus Julius Agricola, they found a Brythonic Celtic tribe already well established here. The Romans called them the Gododdini. Roman writers describe them as a people who, for the most part, kept an uneasy but largely peaceful relationship with the empire, acting as something like a buffer against the fiercer tribes further north.
Around the year 600 AD, the Gododdin made a fateful decision. According to the oldest surviving poem composed in Britain, a work called Ye Gododdin, attributed to the bard Aneurin, their king, Mynethog Moonfar, gathered roughly 300 hand-picked warriors at Din Eidyn. For a full year, he feasted them, arming them, preparing them, before sending them south to strike at an Anglian stronghold called Cattraeth, most likely modern Catterick in North Yorkshire, then held by the emerging Angle kingdoms of Bernicia and Deira. The result was catastrophe. The Gododdin force, heavily outnumbered, was almost completely wiped out. The poem, composed to commemorate the fallen, is one of the great elegiac works of early medieval literature, and it is soaked in grief. Poetic hyperbole telling us that of the 300 who rode south, only a handful, perhaps only the poet himself, ever returned. That defeat left Din Eidyn dangerously exposed. In 638 AD, the Angles of the expanding kingdom of Northumbria besieged and finally took the fortress. The Gododdin's centuries-old hold on this rock was over. For the next 300 years, this hilltop stronghold belonged to Northumbria, a frontier post at the very northern edge of an Anglian kingdom centered far to the south.
It was during this Northumbrian period that the settlement's name began to shift. The Angles fused their own word Burgh, meaning a fortified place, onto the old Brythonic Eden, and over time, the name settled into something recognizable: Edinburgh. The city was born in name, even if the city itself was still centuries away from existing.
The Romans built their own outpost at Cramond around 140 AD, a fort connected by road to the great legionary base at York, more than 250 miles to the south. But Rome's grip on this far northern frontier was always shaky. Twice the empire pushed its border up to the Fourth Clyde line, building the Antonine Wall, and twice it withdrew. By the early 3rd century, Rome had pulled back to Hadrian's Wall for good. The Gododdini remained, largely left to their own devices, their political center gradually shifting toward a dramatic volcanic outcrop rising above the surrounding plain. Over the following centuries, the Gododdini's descendants, now known by the Welsh form of their name, the Gododdin, built a hill fort on that outcrop. They called it Din Eidyn. In the Brythonic language spoken here, Din meant fortress or stronghold, and Eidyn referred to the wider surrounding territory. The most likely location for this fortress was Castle Rock itself. That dramatic plug of volcanic basalt formed some 350 million years ago and scoured into its present shape by glaciers during the last ice age.
Scottish chronicles record that sometime in the mid-10th century, Edinburgh, referred to in the old annals as Oppidum Eidyn, came under Scottish control. And by the closing decades of the century, Lothian as a whole had passed firmly into the Scottish kingdom, formalized through the shifting alliances and occasional grants between Scottish and English kings of the era. The rock that had changed hands so many times over 4 centuries was, at last, Scottish. It is King Malcolm III, remembered by his nickname Canmore, meaning great chief or great head, who begins the true transformation of Edinburgh from a frontier stronghold into something more. Malcolm keeps his royal court primarily at Dunfermline, across the Firth of Forth, but he starts spending more and more time on this rock. Tradition holds that he built a small chapel inside the castle for his second wife, the English Princess Margaret, a woman who would later be canonized as a saint. That chapel, St. Margaret's Chapel, still stands today inside Edinburgh Castle, and it is the oldest surviving building anywhere in the city, though most historians now believe it was actually completed or substantially rebuilt by Margaret and Malcolm's son.
Margaret herself is a genuinely fascinating figure. Born into the exiled English royal house, raised for a time in Hungary, she arrived in Scotland after the Norman conquest of England made her homeland unsafe for her family. She was devoutly religious, famously charitable to the poor of Edinburgh, and unusually well-educated for a woman of her era. She is credited with softening the rougher edges of the Scottish court and drawing it into closer contact with the wider European Christian world. Edinburgh was fortunate to have her, however briefly her life here lasted. Then comes David I, and David I changes everything. Around the year 1130, he formally establishes Edinburgh as a royal burgh. This is the moment the city, in any meaningful sense, truly begins. A royal burgh meant rights, the right to hold a weekly market, the right to trade freely, the right to grow under royal protection. David lays out a long market street running down the ridge from the Castle Rock, the street that will one day be known as the Royal Mile. Merchants are allocated narrow strips of land, or tofts, along each side of the street and told, in effect, to build a house within a year or lose the plot. Behind each house, long, narrow yards called closes stretch back from the main thoroughfare. If you have ever walked the Royal Mile and wondered why dark, narrow alleyways keep branching off at regular intervals on every side, this is why. Those closes are medieval.
They have been there, in one form or another, from the very beginning. David also founds Holyrood Abbey in 1128, at the far end of that market street, down in the valley below the castle. According to a much-loved legend recorded centuries later, David was nearly killed by a stag while out hunting on the Feast of the Holy Cross, and in the moment of crisis, a shining cross appeared between the animal's antlers, saving his life. In gratitude, he founded the abbey on the spot. Whether or not you credit the legend, the abbey becomes hugely important to the city's development. A separate settlement grows up around it, called the Canongate, distinct from Edinburgh proper and governed by its own charter and its own administration. These two communities, Edinburgh and the Canongate, will live side by side, sometimes cooperating and sometimes competing, for centuries. By the close of the 12th century, Edinburgh has real shape. A castle on the rock, a long market street sloping down toward Holyrood, a busy trading port at Leith, a mile to the north on the Forth, and a growing community of merchants, craftsmen, and clergy. It is modest by the standards of the great cities of continental Europe, but it is alive.
Alive, and it is growing. What it is not, yet, is safe. Because to the south, England will soon have a king with very ambitious ideas about who should control Scotland, and he will have his eyes firmly fixed on Edinburgh. The 13th century starts well enough for Edinburgh.
Trade through the port of Leith is growing steadily. The town is prospering under a long run of stable Scottish kings. But the politics of medieval Britain are about to drag the city into one of the most brutal and prolonged conflicts it will ever experience. When Scotland's King Alexander III dies in 1286, thrown from his horse on a stormy coastal clifftop road at night, he leaves no adult heir. The throne is disputed between more than a dozen claimants, and in the resulting political vacuum, the Scottish nobility invite the English king, Edward I, to arbitrate the succession, in a process later known as the Great Cause. It is a decision Scotland will regret for generations. Edward I, Longshanks, one of the most formidable and ruthless kings England ever produced, uses the invitation not simply to help, but to assert overlordship. By the early 1290s,
Edinburgh Castle is in English hands, an English-appointed governor installed within its walls. The Stone of Scone, the ancient stone on which Scottish kings had been enthroned for centuries, is seized and carried south to Westminster Abbey. Scotland is treated not as an independent neighbor, but increasingly as a subject territory. This is the beginning of the Wars of Scottish Independence, and Edinburgh becomes one of their central battlegrounds. Robert the Bruce, who had himself held complicated and shifting allegiances in the early years of the conflict, eventually commits fully to the Scottish cause and is crowned king in 1306. In March 1314, his forces recapture Edinburgh Castle in a daring night raid led by his nephew, Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray. A small band of Scottish soldiers, guided by a local man who knew a disused path, scaled the sheer north face of Castle Rock in near total darkness, climbed the walls with rope ladders, and overwhelmed the sleeping English garrison. The castle falls.
In a matter of months, Robert wins the decisive Battle of Bannockburn, effectively securing Scottish independence, though formal recognition would not come from England for years yet. But the wars are far from over. In the 1330s, English forces returned to Scotland in strength. In 1356, Edward III burns much of Edinburgh during what became known as the Burnt Candlemas, riding into the Lothians in early February and putting the town to the torch. It is a brutal reminder of how fragile urban life was in the medieval world.
A city built largely of timber and thatch on an exposed hillside was always at the mercy of anyone willing to carry a burning torch through its streets. Despite all of this, Edinburgh endures. After English forces seize Berwick, long Scotland's principal port, Edinburgh steps into the gap. Wool, hides, and skins flow out through Leith in growing quantities. Money flows in. By the middle of the 14th century, with the worst of the wars finally cooling, the French chronicler Jean Froissart visits the town, and while noting its modest size compared to the great cities of France, records it as by far the most substantial town in the kingdom, Scotland's own equivalent of Paris. At this point, Edinburgh has perhaps 400 dwellings, small, closely packed, frequently burned and rebuilt. Modest, but resilient. Edinburgh has survived invasion, occupation, and fire, but nothing it. The Black Death reaches Scotland in 1349, and Edinburgh does not escape it. The plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis and spread primarily by fleas carried on black rats, tears through the overcrowded, unsanitary closes and timber tenements of the medieval city. There are no reliable figures for Edinburgh's own losses, but across Scotland as a whole, historians estimate the plague killed somewhere between a third and a half of the population. The streets fall quiet. Entire families vanish from the tax rolls. The trade networks Edinburgh had fought so hard to build go dead for a time. And yet, within a generation, the city rebuilds. This is one of the quiet, persistent truths of medieval Edinburgh. It gets knocked down, and it gets back up. Always. The 15th century brings Edinburgh firmly to the center of Scottish national life. King James III is, as one contemporary chronicler memorably puts it, born, crowned, married, and buried at Holyrood. The city is no longer merely a trading post beneath a castle. It is becoming the royal heart of the nation. James II's reign is also notable for a strange and very Edinburgh kind of drama. He develops a dangerous enthusiasm for artillery, the cutting-edge military technology of his age. In August 1460, at the siege of Roxburgh Castle, one of his own massive cannons explodes beside him, killing him instantly. He was 29 years old. His queen, Mary of Guelders, was reportedly nearby when it happened. His son, James III, inherits the throne, and later in the century makes Edinburgh's status official. In a royal charter of 1482, he describes Edinburgh as the principal burgh of the kingdom, the first formal declaration of what had long been true in practice. Edinburgh is Scotland's capital city. Meanwhile, the city grows physically upward. Land on the narrow ridge between Castle Rock and Holyrood is precious, hemmed in on both sides by steep slopes, and so Edinburgh does something unusual for its time. It builds tall. Multi-story tenements, known as lands, rise along the Royal Mile, among the earliest examples of genuinely high-density urban housing anywhere in Europe. By some later estimates, these lands eventually reach 10 stories or more at their peak, with some accounts describing structures taller still. Edinburgh's cramped geography forces it to innovate. The city becomes vertical long before most of the rest of the continent thinks to try the same thing. Edinburgh is now Scotland's capital in name and in fact. But the most turbulent, dangerous, and dramatic century in the city's entire history is still to come, and it will begin with the arrival of one of the most controversial women ever to set foot on Scottish soil.
The 16th century is Edinburgh's most dramatic 100 years. More happens here in this single period than most cities experience across 1,000. It starts with confidence. Under James IV, Edinburgh is a royal city with genuine European ambitions. James is cultured, multilingual, and popular. He builds a new palace beside Holyrood Abbey, Holyrood Palace, still standing today, intending it as a proper royal residence, rather than simply a monastic guest house. He patronizes the arts, sponsors early Scottish printing, and in 1503 marries Margaret Tudor, daughter of Henry VII of England. For a brief moment, Scotland and England feel as though they might actually get along. Then comes Flodden. In 1513, James leads a Scottish army into northern England in alliance with France, honoring the so-called Old Alliance against the English King Henry VIII. The Battle of Flodden is a catastrophe. James IV himself is killed on the field, along with an estimated 10,000 Scottish soldiers, among them much of the Scottish nobility, bishops, and knights, gone in a single afternoon. Edinburgh's response is immediate and tells you everything about the fear that gripped the city in the aftermath. The citizens hastily construct a new defensive wall, the Flodden Wall, running around the southern and eastern edges of the town. Much of it still survives today. When you walk along the Vennel steps in modern Edinburgh, you are walking beside a genuine fragment of the Flodden Wall, built not in celebration, but in panic. But Flodden is not the worst thing the 16th century has in store for Edinburgh. That comes in 1544. Henry VIII of England, furious that the Scottish Parliament has repudiated an earlier marriage treaty between his son Edward and the infant Mary, Queen of Scots, sends the Earl of Hertford north with orders that leave very little to the imagination. He is instructed to put Edinburgh to fire and sword. Hertford's army does exactly that. They march in and burn the city over several days. The town, Holyrood Abbey, the palace, and the port at Leith are all put to the torch. Contemporary accounts describe a smoke cloud visible for miles along the Forth. This deliberate campaign of destruction, intended to terrorize Scotland into accepting the marriage treaty, became known to history as the Rough Wooing. Henry VIII ultimately gets nothing. Mary is spirited away to France for her own safety. Scotland does not submit, but it takes a generation to rebuild.
and the scars run deep.
The Reformation arrives in Scotland in the 1550s and 1560s, and Edinburgh is at its center. The Protestant reformer John Knox preaches from St. Giles Cathedral on the Royal Mile, a church that has stood on this site in some form since at least the 12th century. Knox is passionate, uncompromising, and absolutely convinced that Scotland must abandon Catholicism entirely. He gets his way. In August 1560, the Scottish Parliament, sitting in Edinburgh, formally establishes Protestantism as the nation's religion. Into this newly Protestant city, in August 1561, arrives Mary, Queen of Scots, Catholic, French-educated, only 18 years old, and walking into one of the worst possible political situations a young ruler could face. Mary had been Queen of France by marriage, Queen of Scotland from birth, and in the eyes of many Catholics across Europe, arguably the rightful Queen of England, too. She's intelligent, politically capable, and in another time and place might have been a genuinely remarkable ruler. But Edinburgh in 1561 is not a forgiving place. Knox despises her openly from the pulpit. The increasingly powerful Protestant nobility distrust her. And the chain of events that unfolds from her arrival at Holyrood Palace reads like a tragedy that keeps getting darker with every act. Her Italian private secretary, David Rizzio, is murdered in front of her, stabbed more than 50 times by a group of conspiring Protestant nobles, including her own husband, Lord Darnley, in March 1566. She is heavily pregnant at the time. Darnley himself is killed the following year in a mysterious explosion at Kirko Field, a house just within the city walls, his body found in the garden showing no obvious blast injuries, a mystery that has never been fully resolved. Mary then makes what many historians consider her most disastrous decision. She marries the Earl of Bothwell, widely suspected of orchestrating Darnley's murder just months after the killing. Edinburgh turns decisively against her. She is arrested, imprisoned at Loch Leven Castle, and forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James. After a failed attempt to regain her throne and a final military defeat at the Battle of Langside in 1568, she flees south into England and throws herself on the mercy of her cousin, Elizabeth I. She would spend the next 19 years as Elizabeth's prisoner before being executed in 1587. Edinburgh Castle itself becomes the last stand for Mary's remaining loyalists in what is called the Lang Siege, a standoff running from 1571 to 1573 that finally ends when English artillery, sent south by Elizabeth to support the pro-Reformation government, batters the medieval castle into submission and rubble. And yet, even amid all of this turmoil, Edinburgh manages one of its most lasting achievements of the century. In 1583, the University of Edinburgh opens its doors, founded by royal charter under the young King James VI. It is one of the earliest civic universities in Britain, founded not by church or pope, but by the town council itself, and it would go on to become one of the most influential centers of learning. In 1603, King James VI of Scotland inherits the English throne on the death of the childless Elizabeth I, becoming James I of England as well. This is the union of the crowns. Scotland and England now share a single monarch, but they remain entirely separate kingdoms with entirely separate parliaments. James moves his court south to London, promising Edinburgh he will return every 3 years. In practice, he returns to Scotland only once, in 1617. Edinburgh, which had been the undisputed seat of a resident royal court for centuries, suddenly finds its king relocated 400 miles south. The city does not collapse, but it loses a significant measure of its political gravity. The religious tensions that had been simmering in Scotland for decades boil over in the 1630s. King Charles I, never the most politically astute of monarchs, attempts to impose an Anglican-style prayer book on the staunchly Presbyterian Church of Scotland. The reaction in Edinburgh is immediate and furious. In July 1637, when the new prayer book is read aloud for the first time at St. Giles Cathedral, the congregation erupts into a riot. According to a much-repeated tradition, quite possibly embellished over the centuries, a market trader named Jenny Geddes hurls her folding stool at the preacher's head. What is not in dispute is what follows: the Bishops' Wars, and then the far wider English Civil War, in which Scotland becomes entangled on multiple shifting sides. Even as politics convulses the nation, Edinburgh still faces something far older and far crueler than any army. The plague returns in 1645, one of its worst outbreaks in the city's history, killing thousands in the tightly packed closes and tenements of the old town.
The city, understandably, has no real understanding of how the disease spreads. Infected families are simply boarded up inside their own homes. Bodies pile up faster than they can be buried. The closes, those narrow medieval alleyways that give Edinburgh so much of its character today, become death traps. A few years later, in 1650, Oliver Cromwell and his Commonwealth forces march into Scotland after the Scots declare their support for the exiled Charles II. Cromwell defeats the Scottish army at the Battle of Dunbar, a crushing and humiliating loss, and marches on to occupy Edinburgh itself. His soldiers are quartered inside Holyrood Palace and in several of the city's churches. Edinburgh remains under occupation for the better part of a decade.
The century closes with one of the most consequential political decisions in Edinburgh's history still being debated in the Scottish Parliament: the question of a full political union with England. Scotland's economy is struggling badly. The disastrous Darien scheme, an attempt to establish a Scottish trading colony on the Isthmus of Panama between 1698 and 1700, has collapsed in disease and disaster, bankrupting a huge share of the country's available investment capital and shattering national confidence. England, meanwhile, is restricting Scottish access to its lucrative overseas trade routes. The arguments in favor of union are largely financial. The arguments against are almost everything else. The Act of Union passes in 1707, dissolving the Scottish Parliament entirely and merging Scotland into the new Kingdom of Great Britain. Scotland's representatives now travel to Westminster in London. Edinburgh loses its parliament. For a city that had been a genuine seat of independent political power for centuries, this is a heavy blow. There are riots in the streets when the act passes. The poet Robert Burns, writing decades later, would famously call it a matter of being bought and sold for English gold. The reality is more complicated than that.
There were genuine economic arguments in favor of union, but the feeling of national diminishment was real, and it lasted for generations. Out of the political quiet that follows the union, Edinburgh produces one of the most astonishing intellectual eruptions in human history, the Scottish Enlightenment. In the coffee houses, taverns, and lecture halls of this compact, crowded city, a remarkable concentration of thinkers begins to reshape how the entire world understands itself. David Hume, arguably the greatest philosopher Britain has ever produced, lives and works in Edinburgh. He challenges the very foundations of religion, causality, and human knowledge with a clarity and rigor that still reverberates through philosophy today. Adam Smith, a close friend and intellectual companion of Hume's, publishes The Wealth of Nations in 1776, the book that essentially founds the discipline of modern economics. James Hutton, examining the geological formations around the city, including the volcanic rock of Arthur's Seat and the strata exposed at Sicker Point along the coast, essentially invents the science of geology, demonstrating for the first time that the Earth is almost inconceivably older than anyone had previously imagined. His work would later lay crucial groundwork for Charles Darwin. In the space of a few short decades, Edinburgh produces thinking that transforms science, economics, philosophy, and humanity's understanding of the natural world. Edinburgh also physically transforms itself in the 18th century. The Old Town, by the mid-1700s, is one of the most overcrowded and unsanitary urban environments anywhere in Europe. The tall tenements of the Royal Mile are packed with thousands of people living cheek by jowl,
and residents still routinely empty chamber pots from upper windows onto the street below, shouting a warning cry, "Gardy Lou," a corruption of the French phrase for "watch out for the water." Visiting tourists remark, often with real disgust, on the stench. Residents simply live with it. The solution is the new town. In 1766, a competition is held for a plan to build a new, rational, elegant residential district to the north of the Old Town, across the drained bed of the Nor Loch, a fetid, stagnant marsh that had once served as part of the city's defenses and now occupies what is today Prince's Street Gardens. A 26-year-old architect named James Craig wins the competition. His plan is a grid. Broad, straight streets, grand stone townhouses, restrained classical Georgian architecture. Construction begins
in 1767 and continues for decades, but the transformation of the city is total. Edinburgh's wealthier residents steadily migrate north into the new town, leaving the old town increasingly, and often desperately, to the poor. Before all of this urban transformation takes hold, Edinburgh has one more dramatic political moment. In 1745, Charles Edward Stuart, grandson of the deposed King James VII and II, and better known to history as Bonnie Prince Charlie, lands in Scotland to reclaim the British throne for the exiled House of Stuart. He marches south, takes Edinburgh without a fight in September 1745, holds court at Holyrood Palace, and wins a stunning victory over government forces at the Battle of Prestonpans, just outside the city. For a brief, extraordinary moment, Edinburgh is once again in royal Jacobite hands. It lasts only a matter of weeks. The prince marches his army south into England, loses his nerve, or loses the confidence of his war council, retreats north, and is finally and catastrophically defeated at the Battle of Culloden, near Inverness, in April 1746. The Jacobite cause effectively dies on that moor. Edinburgh, and Scotland with it, returns firmly to Hanoverian rule. The 19th century is Edinburgh's Victorian age, and it is a century of extremes. Grand civic pride sitting alongside horrifying poverty. Edinburgh begins the century as Scotland's largest city. It does not end it that way. Glasgow, driven by the booming cotton, engineering, and shipbuilding industries of the Industrial Revolution, overtakes Edinburgh in population during the first decades of the 1800s and never looks back. Edinburgh's own economy, by contrast, is built increasingly on law, finance, medicine, and publishing, services rather than heavy manufacturing. The most notorious story of early 19th century Edinburgh is also one of the most grotesque in the entire city's history. In the late 1820s, William Burke and William Hare begin supplying the city renowned anatomy schools with fresh cadavers. The medical school at Edinburgh University is world famous by this point, and desperately short of legally obtained bodies for dissection. Burke and Hare start out simply selling the body of a lodger who had died of natural causes. Then, finding the money too tempting, they start making their own supply. Over roughly 10 months between 1827 and 1828, they murder at least 16 people, deliberately targeting Edinburgh's poor, vulnerable, and often transient population, suffocating their victims before selling the bodies to the respected anatomist Dr. Robert Knox. When they are finally caught, the city is horrified, not least because Knox, who had purchased the bodies without asking many questions, escapes formal prosecution entirely. Hare turns king's evidence against his former partner and walks free. Burke alone is tried, convicted, and hanged in January 1829 in front of a crowd estimated at 25,000 people. His body is, rather fittingly, donated to the very medical school he had supplied. His skeleton is still on display at the University of Edinburgh's Anatomical Museum to this day.
On the other end of the cultural scale entirely, there is Sir Walter Scott. Edinburgh-born and Edinburgh-obsessed, Scott almost single-handedly invents the modern historical novel and makes Scotland, its landscape, its history, and its mythology romantically fascinating to readers across the entire world. When King George IV pays a state visit to Edinburgh in 1822, the first visit by a reigning British monarch to Scotland in nearly 2 centuries, it is Scott who orchestrates the entire spectacle. The tartan pageantry, the assembled Highland chiefs, the theatrical celebration of a newly reimagined Scottish identity. Scotland's image is refashioned almost overnight. Edinburgh becomes a destination for the romantically inclined tourist. The Scott Monument, that extraordinary soaring Gothic spire on Princes Street, begun in 1840 and completed in 1846, becomes one of the largest monuments dedicated to a writer anywhere on Earth. You can still climb it today, all 280
steps, and stand where the city meets the sky. The new town continues to expand throughout the century. Grand Victorian suburbs push out to the south and west. The railway arrives. Waverley Station, named fittingly after Scott's own series of novels, opens in something close to its current form in the 1860s, carved dramatically into the valley between the Old Town and the New Town. It remains the second busiest railway station in Scotland today. But in the Old Town, conditions for the poor remain brutal well into the century. The closes that modern tourists find so charming were, for most of this period, places of desperate overcrowding, disease, and hardship. The social reformer Dr. Henry Littlejohn is appointed Edinburgh's first medical officer of health in 1860 and spends decades meticulously documenting and campaigning against the conditions he finds. The century also produces one of literature's most enduring creations. Though its author, Arthur Conan Doyle, born in Edinburgh in 1859, never lived permanently in the city as an adult, the character of Sherlock Holmes is reportedly modeled in significant part on a real Edinburgh physician, Dr. Joseph Bell, whose extraordinary skill at deductive reasoning from small observed details was already legendary among his students. Edinburgh, in other words, gave the world Sherlock Holmes.
As the 19th century closes and the 20th begins, Edinburgh is a city of real contradictions. Rich and poor, proud and troubled, internationally famous, and in some ways, still curiously overlooked. What is about to happen over the next 100 years will test the city in ways nobody could have anticipated. Edinburgh enters the 20th century as a respectable, somewhat conservative city, a city of lawyers, bankers, and professors, proud of its history and, if anything, mildly suspicious of the future. What follows over the next 100 years is a series of upheavals, none of which Edinburgh handles particularly smoothly at the time, but all of which it survives. The First World War hits Edinburgh hard. Tens of thousands of Scottish men enlist, many of them from Edinburgh regiments. The city sends its sons to the trenches of Belgium and France, to Gallipoli, to the wider Middle East. The Scottish National War Memorial, built inside Edinburgh Castle and completed in
The Second World War brings the city back to grim, purposeful life. Edinburgh is not heavily bombed, unlike Glasgow, Clydebank, or many English cities, but it serves throughout the war as a major military and administrative center. The castle is used as a headquarters. The port at Leith handles enormous volumes of wartime shipping and convoy traffic. And then, in 1947, with Europe still broken and the world still reeling from 6 years of total war, Edinburgh does something remarkable. It hosts the first Edinburgh International Festival of Music and Drama. The founding idea is disarmingly simple. Bring the world's greatest performers together in one city. Help break down the cultural barriers that had contributed to the catastrophe of war, and reconnect a fractured civilization through art. That same year, 8 theater companies who had not been officially invited to perform show up anyway, staging their own shows in church halls and small venues around the city. That uninvited spirit becomes the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. Together, the International Festival and the Fringe grow to become the largest arts festival on Earth. Today, the Fringe alone brings well over 3 million ticketed attendances to Edinburgh every August. The post-war decades also see Edinburgh make some decisions about its built environment that it will later come to deeply regret.
In the 1960s and 1970s, a considerable amount of the old town's historic fabric is cleared away and replaced with brutalist housing schemes and concrete office blocks, in keeping with planning fashions of the era. George Square, once a fine, complete Georgian square, is largely demolished to make way for the expansion of Edinburgh University. Edinburgh, to its credit, eventually comes to its senses and begins actively protecting and restoring what remains of its historic core. In 1995, the Old Town and New Town together are jointly declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site, formal international recognition of one of the most complete surviving examples of Georgian and medieval urban planning anywhere in the world.
Edinburgh's financial services sector also grows significantly through the latter half of the century. The Royal Bank of Scotland, founded in Edinburgh in 1727, becomes by the early 2000s one of the largest banking groups in the world, before a catastrophic near collapse in 2008 requires an emergency government bailout worth tens of billions of pounds. A stark reminder of how completely the city's fortunes had come to depend on finance. And then, in 1997, Scotland votes decisively in a referendum to re-establish its own devolved parliament. After close to 300 years, Edinburgh will have a legislature of its own again. The Scottish Parliament first reconvenes in 1999, initially sitting in temporary accommodation on the Mound, before moving into its striking and controversial purpose-built home at the foot of the Royal Mile in 2004. The building, designed by the Catalan architect Enric Morales, goes massively over both budget and schedule, eventually costing around £414 million, against an original estimate closer to £40 million.
Love it or hate it, the building signals that Edinburgh, after 3 centuries, is once again a genuine seat of government. So what does Edinburgh look like right now, and what challenges does it face going into the future? Today, Edinburgh is home to roughly 500,000 people and receives well over 4 million visitors every year. It is regularly ranked as one of the most livable cities. So what does Edinburgh look like right now? And what challenges does it face going into the future? Today, Edinburgh is home to roughly 500,000 people and receives well over 4 million visitors every year. It is regularly ranked as one of the most livable cities in the United Kingdom, and its Old Town and New Town UNESCO World Heritage status means that much of what makes it visually and historically distinctive remains, at least in principle, carefully protected. The city faces real, present-day challenges. Housing affordability has become a genuine crisis, with property prices rising sharply as the city's global popularity increases year on year. The cost of living is high, and the gap between Edinburgh's wealthiest and its poorest neighborhoods remains significant, an echo, in some ways, of the divide between the new town and the old closes 2 centuries ago. Edinburgh's economy has diversified further still into technology, biomedical research, higher education, and the creative industries that flow from its festivals. And the question of Scottish independence brought sharply back into focus by the 2014 referendum, in which Scotland voted 55% to 45% to remain within the United Kingdom, continues to shape Edinburgh's political life to this day, as the seat of a devolved parliament perpetually weighing its own future. From that ancient hill fort perched on a volcanic rock, 10,000 years in the making, to the modern, complex, debated, celebrated city it is today, Edinburgh's story is one of stubborn survival. It has never been easy here. The winters are long, the politics have often been messy, and the wind coming off the Firth of Forth has always had a sharp edge to it. But this is a city that produced the foundations of modern economics and modern geology, a city whose university has trained some of the finest medical and scientific minds in history. A city that, in the darkest years immediately after the Second World War, decided the best thing it could possibly do for a broken world was to throw open its doors and invite everyone in. If you've enjoyed this journey through Edinburgh's history, please do leave a like. It genuinely